Well, good evening, everyone. I'm David Logan, Chairman of the BIAA. Welcome to this evening. We're a fairly select group, I think. I had emails throughout the day saying that one or two people who were coming have been defeated by the strike, or else the floods. I even had an email from someone who had a seal in their garden in Devonshire. I first of all should say, to acknowledge the help and support we've had in organising this event with Research Turkey, and we're most grateful for that. You've got the flyers in front of you, I'm sure you've seen them, so I barely need to introduce them. Professor Çarkoğlu on my right is, as you all know, an extremely distinguished professor of political science at Koç University and is a very highly respected authority on the political scene in Turkey. Beyond him is Bill Park, who is, as you also see, an academic who knows a great deal about Turkey. I was going to say in particular about the southeast, but actually pretty much all of it, I think it's fair to say, and is a member of the Council of the British Institute. And on my left is John Peet, who is the Europe editor of The Economist, and before that he had a sort of civilized career as a civil servant as well. Short but civilized. And he, although his interests are broad, he is a great expert on Turkey and was responsible, amongst other things, for an extremely authoritative and Turkey supplement. And of course, as some of you know, the relationship between the Economist and Turkey is particularly interesting. Professor Çarkoğlu will introduce the discussion. We'll speak for 7 or 8 minutes, and then our other two speakers will speak, and then we'll have an exchange between the three of them, and then we will have a general discussion after that. And is there anything to drink? Yeah, after that there's something to drink. Yeah. What time do we get the drinks? About 7:45. So, there we go. Right, very good. Ali.
Okay, thank you very much for this invitation and kind words. And I basically at this point don't feel at all authoritative about Turkish politics, which is in a chaos. I asked myself what's happening in Turkey a couple of days back to prepare for this occasion, and I should admit that I have no clue what's happening, but I should make some speculation at least, some informed speculation. Is there a crisis in Turkey? Definitely there is a crisis. And what's the nature of the crisis? It's on the surface, it's an economic crisis. Interest rates have been risen substantially, I think from about 5% to about 10%. And that's quite surprising. Within a couple of hours I received emails from distant friends from Atlanta asking me whether or not there was a typo in the news. That is this real? That, they've risen it from 4.7 or so to 10%. I said, no, there is no typo. And I was talking to one of the members of our alumni yesterday evening, and he gave me a banker's perception of what's happening. He says, the sovereign risk is increasing in Turkey. I had to ask, do you mean that, do you really take into account that, there could be difficulties of payment, the sovereign debt will be defaulted? He says, no, that's not at all the point. The point here is that the uncertainty is rising. And when the uncertainty is rising, obviously money wants to go to some money, not all, wants to go to safer places. So what they do is they send bonds in Turkey. They get Turkish lira in return. So what do? They go out and buy dollars or whatever exchange they need, and that raises the exchange rate, obviously, and that effectively led to about 20% devaluation over the last 2 months, since the 17th of December. From 1.93, we are now about 2.25 Turkish liras against a dollar. So it's very significant. So the central bank is raising the interest rates, but if the line of causation that I already gave to you about sovereign risk is the real cause behind the rising exchange rates, that's not going to be a permanent solution because the risk has not changed. And if the risk is not changing, then that's going to slow the loss of value for a few weeks, but then it's going to pick up. Now, I should give perhaps a minute or two summary of how AKP came to power so that we see where it could go. It came to power with a failure of the centrist politics in Turkey. No one now remembers the names of those parties, but once we had the Motherland Party, the True Path Party, and we still have the CHP, but that's the only party that remains with us from the old group. Their failure, the clumsy relief efforts after the 1999 earthquake, for those of us who have been through that experience, we felt like they couldn't even save us under the rubble, leave alone meeting the expectations, economic and social. So that basically meant a total discreditation of the center parties. The economic crisis followed with flying constitution. As you would remember it in those days, the president apparently threw the constitution towards the prime minister, perhaps a little longer distance than I did, and that the prime minister admitted that there was a constitution throwing in the National Security Council, and the economy collapsed. And at the time, the old versus new generation pro-Islamists were also fighting among themselves. And those four critical factors prepared ground for AKP to come to power with only 34%. We were actually talking just a minute ago about the vote that Erdogan got when he got elected in 1994. To my recollection, he got 25% when he won the mayor's position in 94. So he got 34% under those extraordinary conditions and came to power, but that basically meant that the AKP lacked legitimacy in the eyes of many because we had Genç Party, Young Party at the time, which stole votes from especially the True Path Party, pushing all other parties below 10%, so that only two parties remained above 10%, and with 34% of the vote, AKP won 67% of the seats. That's such a difficult position to justify in the long run. So they basically were successful in giving priority to economic policies, and they were successful in winning the 2007 election. But I have to remind you here that the first round of resistance came before the 2007 election, in the presidential election, in collaboration with the CHP and Motherland Party and the Doğru at the time was Democrat Party, I think. The centrist parties basically collaborated and tried to impede, and they were successful in impeding the election of the president by the parliament because of a technical quorum requirement. That you had to have 367 people in the parliament when the candidates were being declared. And nobody could actually secure that many number of people, so it became impossible to start even the process. So it very silly technicality, but the Constitutional Court supported this idea, and that resistance led to the 2007 elections. But that's again a consolidation of the AKP, electorally speaking, because they increased their votes from 34 to 46, I think, percent, and decisively won the election. But at the time, we also were having the so-called Republican rallies. Millions of people were marching in Istanbul, Ankara, Izmir with Turkish flags and protesting against the possibility of the lifting of the turban ban, which, by the way, was lifted a number of months ago without any protests at all at this point. But at that time, that was, I think, the first round of resistance to AKP. I should be quicker than this. So I'm jumping ahead. So what was taking place in the second round of resistance? And that resistance came with Gezi events. But you have to remember also that, the Gezi events are not or should not be interpreted in isolation from the global developments. 2008, you have the global crisis. First Iceland, then Greece goes under. Then you have, unrest in Tunisia, spreading into Egypt, and then you have Spain and US being affected. Turkey also feels similar type of economic pressures, and this is perhaps not directly reflected in the Gezi events, but not first round, but second round Gezi events. When you have environmentalists protesting, that was one thing, but then you started seeing, deep left organizations using working class stone throwers, basically, against the police. So that's Gezi in the first round and Gezi in the second round. And I think that has links to the global anti-capitalist movement as well. In 2011, AKP became a predominant party, which meant that it has several, it brings together several characteristics of a predominant party. One is the failure of the opposition. Why? Because in three repeated elections, if a party wins, then the fourth election is no longer uncertain. Everybody knows that they're going to win. Nobody discusses, even today, that AKP is going to lose the elections. They're going to lose votes, but they're not going to lose the election. They're not going to be second party to another winner. What that means is that any credible candidate from the opposition should be a fool to actually become a candidate. So they refrain from entering into politics from the opposition. That means the opposition doesn't attract the good quality candidates in a predominant party. So typically, the failure of the opposition actually facilitates a predominant party's success in the long run. And that's also very typical of the Turkish politics, because in any such gathering, I think eventually we will talk about what's going to happen to CHP and, what's the reason why CHP cannot basically gather good, solid electoral support. Well, they can't because they're not attracting credible candidates at this point. Another important few things that are related to one another is a sense of compliance by the bureaucracy. I remember, for instance, the governor of Konya leaves everything and rushes to the airport to welcome a minister during an election campaign. The minister happens to be Ahmet Davutoğlu, an important minister, but he is running for election. This is a campaign. And the governor is not supposed to go and meet him at the airport, but they do. And when asked, why on earth do you do this? He says, he's going to be my minister. Going to be my minister, meaning, the governor basically predicts the future outcome of the election, which means a different sort of dynamic is now at play in Turkish bureaucracy. They are no longer putting on the brakes. And that's going to also create a tendency to corruption, obviously, and we apparently have written about this with Ersin Kalaycıoğlu in a couple of years back, because we looked into Japan, we looked into India. Predominant party systems usually collapse because of two reasons: inner fighting within the party factions start fighting with one another, and corruption that comes together. But most important at this stage is, I think, also telling about the developments in Turkey, is the overconfidence or the so-called hubris syndrome at the leadership of the party. And that had a huge impact on Gezi events. The fact that the Prime Minister calls quite significant numbers of people çapulcu, and I should remember the translation in English, but I now know that many people know the term in Turkish because it became a term of its own, I think was simply unacceptable. Sorry? I'm sorry, it's the phone? Okay. So the overconfidence led to Gezi Park, and the tendency to corruption led to the December 17th charges. But the real issue here, I think, is why did this corruption charges surfaced at all? The so-called community or Jemaat or the Gülen movement or the service movement, they are very good in repackaging themselves. 10 years ago we used to call them a brotherhood. Now they are being called a service movement. It's a big change. But we can think of perhaps three reasons, and I'm going to stop there. The Gülen movement is a global movement. Whether you like it or not, they have an extensive network all over the world, which opens them to quite a number of influences and necessitates their autonomous and independent position taking from the central government. What we know is that in the Blue Marmara event, they had a different view of how Turkey should and could react pre-event and post-event. They appear to have a more cooperative approach towards Israel and US, especially concerning Turkish foreign policy towards Iran or the rise of Shia. Gülen movement is of Sunni orientation, and they see Iran's power rising as a policy area where Turkey should act differently than it does today. And all of this leads many people to claim that there's a parallel state apparatus at play. They Turkey is not used to having a civil society movement, which I'm not sure we can call Gülen movement a civil society movement, but it's not a government institution that we know. It is not at all, we are not at all used to having these civil movements having a separate view on critical foreign affairs issues, for instance. Their idealism and achievement orientation is necessary to recruit new people and maintain active membership within the ranks of the movement, and that necessitates constant delivery on many policy issues, policy areas, especially in the education policy area. And the move by the AKP to restrict their ability to expand or maintain their presence in the education sector through dershane or the tutorial institutions was really hurting them. And they also had many privileged access gates open to them to enter into legal and especially education bureaucracy. And that basically ends my act. I already have like 15 minutes. But I'm sure we can talk a little bit more about the elections in Q&A section, because I can't cover all in the first round.
Thank you very much, Ellie. Thank you. John, would you like to the next one? Will, whichever.
I don't mind. You're the chair.
All right. Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely.
Does that work? Yes. Well, I don't want to repeat things, but let me briefly make, I think, 5 observations that are relevant to the elections. I should start perhaps by saying, the question, what does the future hold? I do think the AK party is probably going to win the municipal elections and is probably going to win Istanbul. But I think it is less certain today than it was 3 months ago. I do think an AK candidate will win the presidency, but I'm not sure today who that candidate will be, whereas 6 months ago I would have said it was clearly going to be Erdogan. And I do think, for very much the reasons that Ali gave, that AK will win the next general election, which may be at the end of the year or maybe next year, not because of its own merits, but because of the lack of opposition, lack of credible opposition. So that's my answer to the question. But I think there are a lot of interesting trends that are making these predictions less certain than they might have been. And I do share very much Ali's beginning point. The biggest problem of all for Erdogan and the AK government is now the economy. Journalistically, we tend to focus on things like the Gezi Park protests and now the corruption scandal and, of course, internet censorship and so on. But I think for ordinary Turks, it's the economy that really matters, partly because the appeal of the Erdogan government has, I think, always been that they put an end to the terrible 1990s and the crash of 2001, even if actually the credit for that to quite a large extent belongs to Kemal Dervish and not to the AK government. They were there when the economy improved, and the doubling and in some parts trebling of living standards during the last 10 years has been an enormously important part of the AK's appeal, particularly across Anatolia. But the economy was always more vulnerable than it looked. Turkey habitually has been running a large current account deficit. It's been dependent on capital inflows for a very long time. One of my criticisms of the AK government is they've done actually too little to liberalise the economy, to increase participation in the workforce, particularly among women, and they've left the economy vulnerable, in effect, to what we have seen recently, when as soon as an emerging markets crisis hit, and there was likely to be one when the Federal Reserve talked of tapering, one of the first economies to suffer was bound to be Turkey, because it had a very large current account deficit, was dependent on the hot money inflows. So the fact that we now have Brazil, Turkey, to some extent Russia, and of course Ukraine for different reasons, seeing their exchange rates fall sharply, is not actually a surprise. And I think that I would fault the government for not having done a bit more to prepare that. But as Turkish people start to feel the pinch and worry that their standards of living are not going to go up, that inflation might return, that the lira is declining, I think that is something that could start to turn them against the AK government more than anything else. So that's the most important factor that is creating current uncertainty. The second factor, I do think, is what we rather lazily call a sort of drift in an autocratic direction. You can exaggerate this, but I do think the culmination of some of the things that Ali Çarkoğlu was saying about the developments 2007, 2011, and subsequently, do fit a sort of excessively centralized system with too much power concentrated in the hands of one person, not enough checks and balances. And we saw in the response to the Gezi protests what that can lead to. We've seen in the handling of the media, self-censorship among many newspapers, columnists losing their jobs for being too critical of the government, more journalists in jail than in China, as the famous figure that we like to use, and so on, that this drift in an autocratic direction has, I think, generated more hostility to the AK government, particularly in places like Istanbul and Western Turkey, than was there before. And I very much regret it. And it's clearly been extremely bad for Turkey's international image. I think people thought for a long time that the government was doing very positive things in Turkey, but the events of the past year or so have changed that image, and people now look at Turkey as a place that is not as stable or as secure as it was before. So I think that the drift to autocracy and the polarization of Turkey has been very unhelpful to AK, even if it hasn't yet led them into a position where they're likely to be pushed out of power. Those are by far the two most important things, but I'll just briefly mention three other things that I think are making their life possibly more difficult. One is the foreign policy issue, particularly Syria. The famous Davutoglu policy of zero problems with the neighbours, which is now turned into zero neighbours without problems. I think that's been particularly acute in Syria, partly because the Prime Minister himself became identified so early on with the desire to get rid of Bashar Assad. And because of what's happened in Syria and the spread of some Islamist, jihadist groups and possibly linked with Al-Qaeda, I think that's left Turkey more exposed than perhaps it should have been. And to some extent, some Turks are beginning to be critical of that and saying maybe they made a mistake. Obviously, nobody wants Bashar Assad to stay, but by sticking his neck out, he's left Turkey in a more vulnerable position, and the border is looking a bit rockier than it was. I wouldn't blame Mr. Erdogan for this, because I think Western policy generally towards Syria has been a bit of a shambles over the past year or two. And the fact that the one person who seems to be pleased with himself over Syria is Vladimir Putin is not, I think, a good thing from the point of view of the West or indeed Turkey. So I think that's another thing that is a bit of a problem for AK. Fourth point is the most recent corruption scandals. I put them quite low down my list because I actually take the view, right, maybe I'm wrong, I hope I'm wrong, but I still take the view that actually ordinary Turks think that everybody's going to be corrupt. So they don't think of a corruption scandal as something that is peculiar to the AK party. They think most of the other parties are probably much the same. They even think the Gulenists are much the same. So I think when there is a corruption scandal, I don't think it damages one party rather than the other. I think it probably damages the image of Turkey internationally much more than it damages the position of the government. And as far as I can tell, poll ratings for AK have not really suffered very much since the corruption scandals broke. But it has generated quite a lot of criticism of Erdogan's response in terms of my second point, autocracy, moving police around, getting rid of prosecutors who are getting too close to people who seem too close to him personally, does not create a good image for Turkey, the rule of law, and so on abroad. And that brings me to my last point, which is Turkey and the European Union. David mentioned at the beginning that the relationship of my publication with the government has been a bit strained recently. We actually were extremely strong supporters of the AK government for most of its first 7 or 8 years, and we were always, and still continue to be, extremely strong supporters of the notion of Turkey joining the European Union. But it's become much harder to maintain those two positions during the last 2 or 3 years, and I'm afraid I have come to the conclusion that neither Turkey, under the present Prime Minister, nor the European Union is any longer, neither of them are very serious about the prospect of Turkey joining. And I very much regret that. And what I would like to see at the end of this election year is an outcome that gives some hope of reigniting the talks between Turkey and the European Union, and possibly making people on both sides believe that it is at least conceivable that Turkey could one day join the European Union. And the best way of doing that would, I'm afraid, be if Mr. Erdogan does go as Prime Minister, does not extend his time as Prime Minister, and a more malleable and more consensual figure took over, and the obvious candidate is the current President.
Thank you very much. Bill.
Okay, thank you. When we had the idea for this panel, the crisis between the Gülen movement and the government hadn't yet broken out. And insofar as I was thinking at all of what I might be saying in a couple of months' time, which, to be honest, I wasn't thinking very much about it. But insofar as I was thinking about it, I thought, well, what are we going to say? The AK Party's going to win and Erdogan's going to get whatever he wants.
Yes.
Obviously, with this crisis that broke out, well, openly broke out on December the 17th, everything was thrown up in the air, and I agree with the previous two speakers. It's now become very difficult to predict what the election, all the 3 elections that are coming, might be, and what the impact of this crisis is. So we're all doomed to speculate. And I thought what I would do, because I'm essentially an academic, is turn my speculation into a set of questions. And I've defined this narrowly: questions about the forthcoming election season in Turkey that stem from the crisis between the Gülen movement and the government. So what are the questions that we might ask when trying to explore the impact on elections of this recent crisis? One question, and I think it's a perennial question that doesn't only apply to the elections, is how many Gülenist sympathizers are there in Turkey? I mean, recently, you don't have a membership card. You don't have headquarters somewhere that says the Gülen Club. So you only ever hear that people are inspired by or sympathizers with. People don't identify themselves and can't always be readily identified. We know the institutions, the newspapers and the universities and schools, but we don't always know the people, certainly at street level in Turkey. So you hear figures recently that it might be single-digit percentage of the electorate, 5%, 6%, 7% of the electorate might be Gülen sympathizers. But we don't really know. So I think one question is that. How many Gülenists are there in Turkey that make up the electorate? A second question is, what does it mean to be a Gülenist? Does it mean you slavishly follow whatever Fethullah Gülen says, or your immediate abla says in your network? Or do you still think for yourself? I mean, if there are millions of Gülenists, is it conceivable, possible, that everybody simply does what they're told from on high? Now, I think one of the things we've learned from this crisis is that Gülen is much more the chairman of the board than perhaps some of us thought, and not exclusively a sort of inspirational figure. But even so, does it mean that everyone who's a Gülen sympathizer does what he's told by Fethullah Gülen himself? In any case, Fethullah Gülen says, I don't advise people which party to vote for. We're not a movement necessarily associated with any political party, and I'm still not going to say to people in the light of this crisis how they should vote. So we don't know whether, if there are, let's say, 6%, 7% of the electorate made up of Gülenists, whether they are necessarily going to turn against the AK Party because their network is in a fight with the AK Party government. We don't know what the implications for political behaviour would be. In any case, where would they go in electoral terms? MHP, certainly not JHP, MHP perhaps. Some of the Kurds might go BDP, the smaller Islamic parties. It's not clear what you do, even if you're loyal to Fethullah Gulen, and you see that the government is gunning for Fethullah Gulen, what you do electorally as a consequence. Where does a Gulenist turn if he turns away from the AK Party? I think also when we look at AK Party voters who are not Gulenists, we also have a set of questions. I think we've already heard some reasons why AK Party voters might be disillusioned. The economy is not doing so well. Some of them presumably don't like the authoritarianism that has become associated with the government. And they might also, this may be slightly is at variance with what John said, believe some of the corruption allegations that, if it is the Gülen network, that the police and the judiciary have levelled at Erdogan and his entourage. And I think that might matter electorally because the AK Party sold itself as the clean party. A lot of its electoral support, its capacity to seemingly rise from nowhere after the 2000-2001 crisis, was to do with the message that they were going to be different. They weren't going to be corrupt. And what in fact has happened and is now revealed to AK Party voters is they are at least as corrupt as anything that preceded them. And the investigations and allegations, even if you reassign lots of policemen and judges, I think will have stuck with a lot of AK Party voters, who probably therefore find themselves even more disillusioned than they already were as a result of the performance of the economy and the performance of the economy and the authoritarianism of the government. Also, when we think of the AK Party, we have to think of the party itself. We've kind of forgotten, maybe for the very best of reasons, that, as Ali said, the CHP is the one party that survives. All other Turkish parties blossom, they flower, and then they disappear. And we've forgotten that that might happen to the AK Party. This is not a prediction, but it's a question. It's a thought. If Erdogan is believed to be, or to have become, or after the local elections, or after the presidential elections, to have become, to a degree, an electoral liability, and maybe a liability to the AK Party beyond that as well, it might be that not only might the party turn against Erdogan, it might split. It's not a prediction, it's a thought that might not be rooted in necessarily in the events of the recent weeks, but is rooted in how Turkish political parties evolve. They split, they break up, and they break up under crisis. So it seems to me at least one of the other thoughts that we might have to entertain is one that some of the leadership of the AK Party could turn against Erdogan, start to at least consider the alternatives, as well as some of the electorate turning against Erdogan for the reasons that I've outlined. So it's not only, it seems to me, if not in the short term, then in the medium term, only about Erdogan. It could become also about the AK Party, and might elements of it break away. And I think a final question, I suppose, that occurs to me out of this crisis is, and John mentioned this, where does Abdullah Gül sit? What does he do now? If Turkish politics are difficult to read at the moment, Abdullah Gül is always difficult to read. He plays his cards very close to his chest. I mean, you can hear, I've heard many times that he himself is a Gülen sympathiser. Maybe he is. I don't know if that makes him a Gülenist, but he might have some vague sympathy. He certainly says many of the things about the rule of law and the independence of the judiciary, and that changes have to be constitutional, not just parliamentary amendments to the laws. He says all the same kind of things that Fethullah Gülen is saying about the present crisis. And clearly he by definition has political ambitions. Presumably that's how you get to be president. And I expect they're not over. So I would think that an interesting question to ask is, how does Abdullah Gül read, one, the forthcoming local elections, and does that determine whether he stands for president, which would be the next elections? And if he doesn't, what might be his reaction to whatever the outcomes of the presidential elections are? There is a key player in Turkish politics other than Erdogan. It's Gül. I don't think he's the only key player, but he's the other obvious key player. And we don't really know what he's thinking and how he might behave. So I think that's another question, at least, that we might entertain ourselves with. Certainly after the local elections, what then does Gül do? That's it.
Thanks, Bill, very much. Do you want, are there any points you'd like to follow up between yourselves before we go to Q&A? Do you want to pursue the corruption issue? No?
I think I could make a few additional points.
Yeah.
But
you've come a long way.
let me try to. I think corruption issue will become more important as the economy moves on the negative side over the next couple of weeks. It depends, I think, a lot as to how the Turkish economy develops. As I said, we are already feeling every day the gas prices are rising. I mean, the exchange rate directly affects inflation. People have not gotten more than 5% raise in their salaries. We already lost 20% in exchange, and it's going to hit more and more over the next couple of weeks. If this issue also becomes more hotly debated in the media, I think, and if the economic crisis becomes the issue to talk about before the elections, I think corruption will definitely hit AKP much more seriously. And we say AKP, but AKP supporters really don't like it when we say AKP. They say we are the AK party.
No.
AK party means pure, unblemished, spotless, uncorrupt party. Now they lost that. And that's, I think, going to have an implication in the campaign. One other issue that I'd like to underline is that AKP has changed the local election law, and the greater city municipalities, they used to be, I think, 18, now they are raised to 30, and all of the smaller city or rural communities, they are called belde in Turkish. They used to have municipalities. Now they are not going to vote for their own municipality, but they are going to vote for the greater city municipality, which means AKP voters, which are more likely to be found in the rural areas, will be voting for the greater city municipality. So if they lose support in the urban areas because of economic crisis, they may actually make up for it by the votes that they get from the first time municipal election voters from the villages. I know, for instance, that a villager 200 kilometers away from Konya, Konya is the largest province, will vote for the greater city municipality in Konya. And the municipality is expected to deliver services to that village. The whole thing is completely changed now. It's going to have implications. Would you vote for a municipality from the opposition if you think that the only way you're going to get services is from a government mayor, government party mayor? most likely that's going to have a different dynamic in the minds of the people. If they expect services, they may actually vote for the government party. So there are trends that move, that are likely to push people away from AKP, but there are also other trends that are likely to work in favor of AKP. So this election is very difficult to predict. So let me leave it at that.
Thank you very much. I mean, on that, a very small point, Alice, is anecdotal. I mean, on that last point, I mean, I was talking to someone in a town which had, as it were, been disenfranchised by the Belde, and he was extremely angry about this situation and said, well, you won't expect me to vote for the AK Party, will you? So
We'll see.
Anyway, thank you all very much indeed. Questions? I'm sure there will be some. Well, okay. Friday first. Okay, then.
Question to John Peet. What's the evidence that Gül will be any better? He's supported all the controversial laws passed by Erdogan. The alcohol law, controversial, the law for criminalizing the provision of medical help to protesters, he supported that. He supported the controversial education law that added more religious content to the school curriculum. So what's the evidence, besides that he's more softer version of Erdogan, that he's going to be different than Erdogan? Thank you.
I mean, I think evidence is in short supply. He hasn't yet said he's going to sign the internet censorship law, but it's really the point that Bill made, that in his speeches, he appears to me at least to be agreeing that strict majoritarianism is not the right approach to democracy, that the rule of law, it is very important to have an independent rule of law, that minority rights matter. And he said many things particularly after the Gezi protests, that at least suggested that he felt that the government and that Erdogan in particular had overreacted, and he didn't approve of what they were doing. But yes, he was a co-founder of the party. He's very close, obviously, to Erdogan. I mean, the relationship between the two, I think, is difficult to read from outside. But I think it's perfectly fair to say there isn't any very strong evidence. I just think that the nature of the man suggests to me he's not quite as sort of instinctively hostile to any criticism as Erdogan is. And I think the second point that is worth reflecting on when you look at the possibility of a Gül prime ministership is partly because of his time as foreign minister, partly actually because he also speaks English, understands English, and is quite good at it. I think I'm guessing here, so this is not hard evidence. I think he's probably more conscious of Turkey's image internationally, in America, in Europe, than perhaps Erdogan is. Erdogan doesn't seem to be worried that Turkey's image has suffered a lot in the last 3 or 4 years. My reading is that Gül is worried by that, and that would make a difference. But I agree that's anecdotal, a feeling. It's not really based on hard evidence. I don't know whether Bill...
Yeah, I mean, my sort of response, which might sound facetious, but I think I mean it seriously, is what else does he need to be? I mean, than softer than Erdogan. He's in the AK Party, so yes, he will sign up to restrictions on the sale of alcohol. That's the party that people have voted for. He's president, not prime minister, so his capacities are limited. So if something emerges from the parliamentary majority, he has to be very careful not to make a big political issue of it. So whether he agrees or doesn't agree, he's obliged as president to sign things into law. But I think on some of the issues relating to this present crisis, and I very much agree with John on some of the image stuff. I mean, he understands the need, at least talks like he understands the need for consensus politics, both domestically and in Turkey's relationships with its allies and neighbours. He seems to have held up the idea that the higher, what they call it, HSYK, the higher committee of judges, should be put directly under the justice minister. He seems to have delayed that and said this is a constitutional change, i.e. it's got to be agreed upon by all the parties, rather than a legal amendment that just the ACT Party can push through. So, you know, yes, he's in the ACT Party. He will do things that ACT Party people would expect him to do. He's president, so he doesn't dictate or determine and can't fully resist the programme of the government. But being softer than Erdogan might be all that it's necessary and desirable for him to be. That's maybe enough.
I've got two questions down there. It's one, well, it doesn't matter which order we like.
Hello, my name is Gezi Harrington. Thank you very much. It's Mr. Peet kindly has told us about the what the public thinks about corruption. Would you kindly enlighten us as to what the politicians' concept of corruption is, and are the people in powers salaries enough so that to avoid corruption? And the second question is, what was the reason of the Gülen movement and the AKP party falling apart? What was their argument about? Thank you.
I tried to summarize that towards the end of my my talk, but I think first of all, Gülen movement has a different vision about global politics and foreign affairs than AKP, and that's, I think, important. They have a better grasp of international affairs on many issues, and they are sensitive, obviously, to having access to state apparatus, to bureaucracy, in order to recruit their people. Their networks need access to state bureaucracy in order to deliver their services, let's say. And that's necessary because their finances depend on it, and their ideology, self-justification as to why they exist, requires that kind of facilitation by the state apparatus. And it looks like that success in the early stages has created jealousy among other Islamist movements, which have been eliminated apparently by the Gülen movement when and if they have access to the state apparatus. In a sense, they seem to have, quote unquote, cleansed all the other groups and dominated the bureaucracies that they had access to during the tenure of AKP. And that creates a new coalition that now AKP leadership is using against the Gülen movement. And I think the timing, when now, is obviously linked to the elections, and the timing came right after the main figures of the next election were determined by the party, which suggests to me that the leadership of Gülen movement basically said, my God, we're not having our people elected in the next round of municipal elections. Our sources will be cut from the municipality side, which suggests to us that, which suggests to me that they're not going to have much of an access in the next round of elections, in the national elections. So it's not that difficult to predict what's coming. AKP leadership is cutting access to Gülen movement in the bureaucracy, in local municipalities, as well as most likely in the next round of general elections. What was the first question?
About corruption. How do ministers...
What's the concept of corruption for Turkish politicians? Like, what do they understand from it? What does it mean?
I'm pretty sure they know exactly what we mean by by corruption. I mean, a 10% cut is corruption. 5% is even corruption. So any cut is corruption. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if they have any kind of indecisiveness about this. They know, but there is also some tricky issue here. Remember the minister who says, who I forget, Albayrak, I forget his name, the minister responsible for the Turkish, basically said that he's resigning, but also the prime minister should resign because he did everything with the knowledge of the prime minister, which suggests that the reason why you find all these monies, $4 million in shoeboxes in a bank CEO in the household, and money counting machines. Why would you have money counting machines? You would have money counting machines if this is a regular operation, and this is done with the understanding of a system. You give us some money, we count, we make sure that you don't give us a few thousand less, a few thousand more. It's very organized, and everybody gets their own cut. Not necessarily pocketing the money into their Swiss bank accounts. But this is used within the system. I'm not sure for what purposes, but it sounds like there is an understanding of a system.
What is the number of parliament salary?
But I doubt this is really that pressing for. It's not because they don't have enough money that they are engaged in corruption.
It's also not only members of parliament, it's governors and mayors and candidates and so on.
Get on with it. Michael.
Thank you. Michael Roberts. I was at the British Embassy during most of the first Erdogan government, and I have to admit that I was swept up in the fervour, the pro-Erdogan fervour of that period. I think it's probably fair to say that most of us were. I agree with everything that the panel said, particularly with John Peet's 5 points and his sixth conclusion. With slight shading, people here in London always overestimate the extent to which corruption might determine the outcome of the next election. I think we just tend to exaggerate its effect. And on one point related to the weakness of the opposition, of course, is that AK Party is supremely well organised for electoral purposes, and its machinery is absolutely superb in this area. That said, and given everything we've heard, I think the central scenario for this year remains that essentially Gül and Erdogan swap jobs. And what I haven't quite heard the panel say, and I was a little late, so perhaps I missed it, but I haven't quite heard exactly how this happens. Timelines, what comes first, what are the signals, just so that we can have in our minds, as the year progresses, a sense of where the central scenario is going wrong and where something else is going to happen. Perhaps you can help.
Who's going to try that one? Andy.
Well, I'm probably the least knowledgeable person on the panel about Turkey, but I think you can envisage a timeline, but it seems to me to have gone wrong in the past 6 months, really. But 6 months ago, you could envisage a timeline which was that as you approach the July election, possibly after a change of the constitution, Erdogan agrees that because of the AK Party rules, he has to step down as prime minister, and he then runs with Gül's approval for president. Having done that, Gül then takes over the chairmanship of the party. That bit may be more difficult to arrange because Erdogan clearly wants to continue to have some influence in the party. And then having happened, we would have to have presumably an interim prime minister. It is then agreed that there should be a general election towards the end of the year, after which Gül becomes prime minister. That was the scenario that people seemed to be talking about 6 months ago. I think the trouble is that the last 6 months of events have just made all of the steps of that scenario very much more uncertain. But
I have to also underline that, if Erdogan moves to presidency, I think he would be asking for a constitutional arrangement to make him more powerful. He is not, I think, ready to actually step down in terms of power access and become a secondary figure. After all, I think in our present system, Gül is not as powerful as Erdogan.
Certainly.
Definitely. So I don't think Erdogan is ready to step down and accept a retirement position and basically signs on whatever bill that Gül government will then send to him. He will be much more, imposing, and he is more. I can see him calling for National Security Council meeting, as Süleyman Demirel did in the 1990s, because he has the right to do so even under this constitutional arrangement. Or he would want to chair the cabinet. He can do that if he wishes to. What will happen if he wants to do that when Gül is the prime minister? I doubt we will have an easy flow under those circumstances. So I see that swap of positions as completely problematic. It's going to create a real problem in the way things are being done in Turkish Executive Office. That swap is possible if Erdogan feels comfortable. He can actually change the constitution into an Alaturka presidential system. It will be definitely an Alaturka system. It's not going to be like a presidential system that the Americans have or the French have. It's going to be a very much of an Alaturka system. It will be. It is likely to be a more of a sultanate than a presidential system. And only then he will accept that swap. Otherwise, I think if I were him, I would rationally stick to my prime minister's position.
Yeah, just as a footnote, remember that there was a constitutional commission, a four-party commission chaired by Mr. Cicek, to create a new president of a kind that Erdogan wanted, and that fell apart. So what we don't know is, we knew then what Erdogan wanted, to be president under this newly redesigned constitution. Right now he hasn't got that, so the question remains an open one.
There was a question very early on. Were you the next one? Yeah, okay. I don't know. Were you or not? Well, if not, someone. Okay, fine. Okay, go ahead. Then I'll go in the middle again.
My name is Katerina Dallacura. I wanted to ask a broad question about institutions, the rule of law, and liberal civil rights and the respect of that. If you look over the last 10 years, of course, we have had in power a government which has clearly authoritarian tendencies, but nevertheless, there's been a switch in dominant political elites, and there have been a number of legal reforms in that direction. Has the country's democracy, has its democratic system become a little bit more firmly embedded in the sense of rule of law? And has that filtered down in popular perceptions, or has there been a reversal in that area, in your estimation? I know it's a big question, but it came to me as you were speaking about corruption and, of course, the response to the corruption issues.
I always refrain from making an evaluation about legal affairs. I'm not at all knowledgeable, but my feeling is that the Turkish rule of law has not gotten better in the tenure of AKP, but it has gotten even worse. On many occasions, I remember the Prime Minister stepping into areas that he's not supposed to be even talking about. The very case in point is Gezi Park events. This is a simple municipal regulation. He had no jurisdiction even over the decision. But he basically pushed aside Kadir Topbaş and started to make comments about the Gezi Park arrangements. And he speaks very authoritatively. He says, we're going to build this. When he says we, who are we? He's not the mayor. He doesn't have authority over mayors in municipal council. He cannot order anything to the Istanbul municipality. No such thing. Legally speaking, he's someone not as simple as me, but legally speaking, he doesn't have any jurisdiction over these affairs. But he talks about it, and people take his positions as a little less than an order, and they will deliver. That's the difficult position of the Turkish rule of law. He talks about different court cases before the decisions are taken, and he acts. He calls for prosecutors to act immediately. For instance, the prosecutors are supposed to be acting independent of the executive office holders' wishes, autonomously. So I'm sure if you were to invite a constitutional lawyer here, I think he or she would give you a much more sophisticated account of all of the incidences where rule of law violations have increased.
I can take these two questions together. Fard, if you would keep your questions for afterwards during the drinks period, if that's all right. Yeah.
My name is David Boxon. This is going slightly off the topics we've been discussing, but I'd just like to pick up a point which John Peel made about the possibility of successful negotiations with the EU. I'm not totally up to date with the press comment. I was up to about 4 or 5 days ago, just before the recent visit by the Turkish delegation to Brussels. But it seemed to me that all the press, whether it was American or European or indeed from elsewhere in the world and the Arab countries, predicted that Erdogan was going to have a tough time going to Brussels. He'd get a lot of criticism over the 17th December corruption scandal. But in fact, he doesn't appear to have done. It was a huge delegation. It was a third of the cabinet, I believe. And I've not seen anything in the press, and I haven't read it just in the last couple of days, but I haven't seen anybody comment, having said he was going to receive this criticism. I haven't said anybody confirming that he did have a tough time there. In addition to that, it's obvious that the government has been engaged in an enormous amount of international diplomacy. They've been to Japan, they have been to Germany, Spain, Gül has been to Italy. So things are looking quite rosy as far as that's concerned.
Okay.
Despite
Jill. No, that's,
my name is Jill Sindel. To what extent do the panel think that secularism or the retreat from secularism will be a factor in decision how to vote in the elections?
Very quickly, I can answer this issue. The sensitivity towards the violations of secularist principles have lost its salience over the past couple of years. I think on that ground, on that issue, I think Turkish politics have, quote unquote, been normalized. People see this not much of a threat at this point. And the political parties also are not pushing that line of argument. Even CHP doesn't seem to make that argument significantly at this point.
John or Bill, do you want to take the foreign point?
Shall I just make a couple of comments, if I may? I know we're running short of time, but one thing I wanted to say on corruption and perceptions of corruption. my understanding, looking at Transparency International ratings, is Turkey isn't regarded as sort of more corrupt than you would expect for a country of its size and development. It's actually probably seen as middling. I think, in a way, the problem that you see with corruption, and this also applies to the rule of law, you could generalize this to almost any country in the world. If you have a party in power, and particularly one person in power, for a period of as long as 10 years, then I think things go wrong. That's what happens. I think the American presidential rule of 8 years and that's it is actually a very good one. And I remember being talking on the subject of corruption in Eastern Europe after the end of communism, and somebody from the Baltic countries saying, well, the one thing that stops corruption really getting entrenched here is that every single election the government loses. It doesn't matter what the government does or who is in power, they always lose the election. And that is a very good way of stopping corruption growing, and I think that applies also to the rule of law. The only thing I would say about the rule of law is that 10 or 15 years ago, if we'd been having this discussion, we might have been talking about a possible military intervention, which may be even worse than having questions about the rule of law. But on the EU, what I was told, whether to believe it or not, was that privately a lot of criticism was expressed to Erdogan and his team, but it was decided by Van Rompuy and Barroso and others that actually they should just be diplomatic publicly. The last EU report on Turkey was also very critical, and that predated the 17th of December developments. So I don't think the relations are particularly rosy. And certainly, as far as most EU heads of government are concerned, the negotiations with Turkey simply aren't making any progress, and we've got the Cyprus problem and all the other problems that we know about. So I wouldn't have a particularly rosy view.
Thank you. Alan and Fadi, I'm going to ask you to ask your questions when we're having a drink, if that's all right. Thank you very much indeed, Ali, John, Bill. I think it's extremely informative. I've learned a lot, and you've given us a lot of food for thought. Thank you very much indeed.